The market is focused on the wrong vector. Media fixates on Patriot missile systems in Qatar and upgrades to Bradley fighting vehicles. This is a kinetic distraction. The kinetic cost of a protracted conflict is a liability the system cannot afford. The real threat is not the missile launch. It is the strategic silence that precedes a market collapse. The West's terminal vulnerability is not military. It is mathematical. Record sovereign debt, as confirmed by the New York Times, has created a solvency crisis waiting for a trigger. The most efficient trigger is not a hypersonic missile. It is a targeted information blackout, an asymmetric attack designed to sever the central nervous system of the global economy. According to analysts at CSIS and RUSI, the two primary vectors are silent and catastrophic. First, the undersea fiber optic cables that carry over 95% of all international data and $10 trillion in daily financial transactions. Second, the blinding or spoofing of satellite constellations vital for GPS, communication, and intelligence. This is not warfare, it is economic decapitation. This is the blueprint for the blind Leviathan. A superpower, unmatched in kinetic force, is rendered inert when its data feeds are cut. Its fleets are adrift, its markets are in freefall, and its debt becomes unserviceable. It cannot take the first punch. This is why U.S. military doctrine, per recent reports, now weighs preemptive precision strikes. It is a launch-on-warning protocol, not against missiles, but against any actor with the capacity to turn out the lights. The motive is not ideology. It is insolvency. The New York Times confirms that record sovereign debt in Western nations is now a systemic threat to global growth. For state strategists, this is not an economic headline. It is a terminal liability. CSIS analysis confirms that a protracted, unpopular war is a vector for catastrophic domestic resource drain. A nation financed by debt cannot absorb the kinetic cost of a grinding, symmetric conflict. It would trigger a solvency crisis, where the funding of the war itself collapses the bond market that keeps the state alive. This financial fragility forces a pivot to asymmetry. Weakness mandates a new doctrine. When you cannot survive taking a punch, the only viable protocol is to strike before the punch is thrown. This is the strategic logic behind reports that the U.S. weighs precision strikes on foreign officials. This is not a threat. It is a declaration of a new launch-on-warning posture, but the target is an economic shock, not an incoming missile. The goal is to decapitate a threat before it can trigger a market collapse. This is not theory. It is deployed hardware. Satellite imagery confirms forward deployments of U.S. Patriot missile systems into locations like Qatar, placing them within kinetic range of Iranian assets. Simultaneously, the Pentagon awards contracts like the $228 million Elbit deal to install Iron Fist active protection on Bradley vehicles. This isn't a blueprint for a long war. It's the signature of a force designed to execute a sudden, overwhelming first strike and survive the immediate asymmetric blowback. The system is too fragile to absorb a conflict, so it has been re-engineered to initiate one. The central equation is the kinetic cost. Analysis from the Royal United Services Institute, RUSI, is irrefutable. A $5 million main battle tank can be neutralized by a $500 first-person view drone. This is not a balanced exchange. It is a mathematical blueprint for economic exhaustion. This gross asymmetry in lethality is known as the democratization of violence. The capability to inflict strategic damage is no longer the monopoly of capital-intensive state militaries. A non-state actor or a second-tier power can now impose debilitating costs on a superpower, effectively leveraging a few $1,000s to liquidate assets worth billions. The response is an admission of this systemic vulnerability. The Pentagon's $228 million contract for Elbit's Iron Fist system is not a display of strength. It is a fiscally ruinous attempt to patch an asset that is now economically indefensible. The cost to defend the platform has become a greater liability than the platform itself. This unsustainable cost exchange vector, compounded by record sovereign debt, is why the doctrine has shifted. The system cannot absorb the shock of an attritional conflict. Therefore, deterrence has been replaced by a launch-on-warning protocol for economic threats. Forward deployments of assets like the Patriot missile system and the publicized consideration of precision strikes are the blueprint in action. A kinetic decapitation of a threat before it can trigger a market-collapsing solvency crisis. Analysts at RUSI and CSIS track vectors of regional instability, from warnings over South Africa to internal fragility in nations like Canada. This is not random chaos. It is a network of proxy laboratories, controlled environments to stress test the system's response protocols. These flare-ups are not the cause of the crisis. They are the diagnostic symptoms of a terminal condition. The core liability is not geopolitical. It is mathematical. Record sovereign debt in Western nations, as documented by the New York Times, has erased the capacity for strategic endurance. The system can no longer absorb the economic shock of a protracted, asymmetric conflict. This financial insolvency dictates a new military doctrine. The primary staging area for this new protocol is not a lab, but an active theater. Satellite intelligence confirms the forward deployment of U.S. Patriot missile defense systems to Qatar. The placement is not defensive. It is offensive staging, putting critical Iranian infrastructure within a kinetic launch window. This is the physical manifestation of a launch-on-warning posture. The shift from deterrence to preemption is now policy. Reports confirm the U.S. is weighing precision strikes on Iranian officials. This is not a plan to win a war, but to decapitate a threat before it can trigger a market-collapsing solvency crisis. It's asymmetric escalation in reverse. The financially fragile superpower must execute a first strike because its system cannot survive taking a punch. The kinetic cost of this doctrine is being pre-calculated. The Pentagon's $228 million contract for Elbit's Iron Fist active protection system for Bradley fighting vehicles is the receipt. It's an admission that even in a surgical first strike, they anticipate intense, asymmetric resistance. The objective is to harden assets not for a long war, but to survive the immediate, violent blowback of their own preemptive attack. The launch-on-warning protocol is a function of game theory, not aggression. Analysts at CSIS define it as an automated response protocol. The moment early warning systems detect an incoming strategic-level attack, a retaliatory launch sequence is initiated before the incoming weapons can detonate. The system cannot wait for confirmation of impact because confirmation means decapitation of command and control. The critical vulnerability is not the missile, it is the radar. In the fog of digital war, an asymmetric cyber attack becomes the primary vector for escalation. A sophisticated actor does not need to launch a physical first strike. They only need to blind the satellite and ground-based radar systems. For the commander in the bunker, a black screen and a loss of signal is indistinguishable from a successful decapitation strike. This forces a zero-sum choice. Is the blindness a technical glitch, a cyber attack, or the prelude to kinetic impact? Waiting to find out risks total systemic failure. The protocol, therefore, forces the commander to assume the worst-case scenario and initiate the launch sequence out of fear. When the underlying system is already fragile due to record sovereign debt, the tolerance for any economic or military shock is zero. The doctrine of preemption, evidenced by forward deployments and plans for precision strikes, is the logical, terrifying outcome. Strike before you can be blinded. The calibration event will not be a missile launch. It will be an electronic blackout. Its function is to quantify the kinetic cost required to trigger a solvency crisis in Western markets, which, according to the New York Times, are already terminally leveraged by record sovereign debt. CSIS reports confirm that the new domain of asymmetric conflict is critical infrastructure, not open battle. This is the test. Within the next 12 months, anticipate a multi-day, attribution-ambiguous disruption of a critical energy choke point, most likely the Strait of Hormuz. The vector will be sophisticated GPS spoofing, or a localized communications grid collapse targeting maritime navigation. The objective is not to sink a vessel, but to halt traffic, spike global energy prices, and stress test the West's financial system. This is the designated tripwire. The pre-positioned Patriot systems and consideration of precision strikes are not for deterrence. They are components of a launch-on-warning protocol against an economic attack, because the system cannot absorb the shock.